One of the things I believe in now is listening to people and hearing them express what are the things that they most want to show the world and allowing them the space to show that more. Because ultimately, when a person doesn't bring their true gifts into the world, it really doesn't help anyone. It doesn't help them. It doesn't help us. And we need more of that, especially in the innovative spaces. That person who's holding the key to the next big drug discovery is the scientist who's, not being heard.
All right, welcome to another episode of Life Sciences 360. My guest today is Tony Martignetti, and he is one of the top leadership development voices on LinkedIn. He's an advisor to a bunch of tech and life sciences executives and leaders. He does business and executive leadership coaching. He's written a bunch of books. I'm sure I'm missing some accolades in there, but I don't want to spend too much time in the intro. Let's dive in and have a chat with Tony today. Welcome to the show, Tony.
Well, thank you so much for having me. The accolades are not necessary. We just have a good conversation, right?
Yes, absolutely. And talking about good conversation, I was going through your content on LinkedIn because I like to do that just to understand what my guests are writing on LinkedIn or on their blogs and whatnot. And the one thing that jumped out to me is that you are a big advocate of inspired leadership. I think your business is also named Inspired Academy or
close. Inspired Purpose Partners.
Okay, Inspired Purpose Partners. Yeah, sorry about that. So question I had for you is, what, being an advocate of inspired leadership, what book or person had a big impact on you, or inspiration for you in your career?
Yeah. Well, can I do one of each?
Yes.
I'll start with a person. A person for me that has inspired me a lot in my career, particularly in the life science industry, is Henry Tamir. Henry Tamir was the CEO of Genzyme. He's passed away now quite a few years now. I think it's been at least 7 or 8 years. And what was really amazing about Henry is, first of all, his belief in people. He believed in people before they were ready to believe in themselves, and he gave them chances to step up into their potential. So he was amazing. Also, he really believed in investing in rare diseases, which is something that at the time wasn't a big. At the time when he was doing it, it wasn't as popular as it is today. So he was amazing. And a book, I'll just choose a book that I'm reading recently, that I've read recently, which I really found interesting. And it was hold on a second. This should be an easy one. It's called No Rules Rules by Reed Hastings and Aaron Meyer. It's the story of Netflix approach to culture and their desire to really look at flexibility versus stringent rules, and how they just hold people accountable to doing the right thing.
Yeah? Yep. No rules. Okay, I'll have to check that out. I had never heard of it, but I will add that to my reading list. So you talked about Henry, and you mentioned how he invested in people, right? So when you're doing coaching with other leaders, whether it's in tech, whether it's in life sciences, what are some of the, I don't want to call it mistakes because they're not really mistakes, but what are some of the missed opportunities that other leaders are not doing, investing in people, that you saw people like Henry have been doing really well?
Yeah, a lot of people who I saw doing it wrong were, really choosing people based on their pedigree. What did they prove already? Not based on their potential, but instead based on, what do they already do? And I think that's a challenging way to look at people, because if you only look at their past performance, then you're leaving a lot of potential unexplored. And I think
Yeah.
we need to do more of that, is to say, where could this person be taken? How can we take an uncut diamond and make them
Mm,
into a diamond that could be polished and made into someone who's a real star?
yeah. Yeah. No, that's a very important point, and I personally feel like there were many times in my career where, uh, whether it was interviewing for a role or whether it was pitching to a client when I was starting my consulting firm, I felt like I was in that boat. I felt like I was being I, obviously I cannot go and recreate the past or show something that I haven't done, but I was self-aware. I knew that I could compete or execute at the same level as others who've done it for 20 years. But yes, it is a mental, it's a challenge, and it's a lot of friction that I observed where, hey, no, but you haven't shown it, or I don't see this on your resume, so I don't know how to trust that you will do it, right? So, and it's always like gut wrenching to hear that, and it's like, oh man, like it comes down to that ultimately, right? So
Hmm.
yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's why one of the things I believe in now is really listening to people and hearing them express, what are the things that they most want to show the
Mm,
world, and allowing them the space to show that more. Because ultimately, when a person doesn't bring their true gifts into the world, it's really doesn't help anyone. It doesn't help them. It doesn't help us, and we need more of that, especially in the innovative spaces, because that person who's holding the key to the next big drug discovery is the scientist who's not being heard.
mm, mm. Yes, yes, and I think you're I haven't watched your complete TED talk, but I've watched some of your posts around it. But it was on this topic, right? Like, don't check yourself at the door or something. You had written a post around it. Do you want to talk a little bit about what the main premise was of that TED talk?
I'm happy to, and
Yeah.
definitely, from my perspective of what that talk is about, it's really this sense of bringing ourselves into the room, and
Mm,
expressing our full selves. As it's not just about the big things, like making sure we express our gender, or our family background, or even our social, economic background. Some people who are afraid to share that they grew up in, maybe they grew up in, homeless, or they grew up
mm.
in a place where they just were poor, and they don't want people to know that, because it makes them look like they've got a kink in the armor. So a lot of
Yep.
people show up and they hide parts of who they are because they're afraid. They're afraid of being judged, or afraid of not getting opportunities. So that's what the talk's about. But it's also about the people who are hiding their brilliance in other arenas. For example, I worked with a few people who have these really amazing hobbies and gifts outside of work that needed to be celebrated and not held back. I worked with a data scientist who was a violin playing virtuoso, and just having her bring that into the workplace helped her feel more confident, and people around her started to see her differently. And I think that was really a beautiful moment, and it helped her to bring her full self, all of the parts of her, into the work.
Right. Yeah. That's a great example. And then for leaders and for managers who are leading different types of teams, how can they encourage, their team members to quote unquote bring their complete selves to work? Like, should they be doing some team gathering events, or like doing a survey asking people about their hobbies? Like, what are some actionable tips you can share?
Yeah, I mean, in the talk, I talk about this idea of the core model, which is, based in curiosity, being open,
Mm,
and releasing your tension of releasing. You're setting. If you're releasing, you're basically letting go of any, reservations, and then expanding. It's about expanding the circle. But as a leader, I'll just kind of take this to a high level and say the leader has to go first, has to be curious first with themselves to say, what is it that I'm holding back? What are the things that I need to share? Because by me modeling the way, by me being my full self, I'm going to let people know that it's okay for them to be okay, sharing who they are. If they're reserved, they're not being, fully themselves, other people notice that. When you've seen leaders who show up in the room and they're very reserved, or maybe they play a good game of acting for many years, and then all of a sudden you see a different side of them, and
Yep.
you're like, where did this come from?
Yep.
The reality is people see right through the facade. So it's best to try and connect with, like, what is it about me that makes me unique? Who am I
Hmm.
really? And how can I bring more of that in a very authentic and real way into the workplace? And then the opening up is about sharing that with others. And then the
Yep.
releasing is like releasing any tension, any reservations that you have about that. Because it's challenging to kind of say, hey, like, I'm going to be sharing maybe something about myself I've never shared with anyone else.
Hmm. And do
And
you,
then expanding is about getting other people to do the same.
okay. So that's the core framework. And uh do you think that, like the example that you were giving, that there's a lot of leaders who are basically preventing and bringing out their true selves, or they know they have some sort of self perception, but they're afraid to bring that out because they don't know if it will positively or if it will negatively impact their career or their promotion opportunity or being liked by others and whatnot. So I'm guessing that at some point, like you said, it damages their you know chances of innovating or doing something different, or even their credibility. So what how can people figure out what their true self is before they even decide whether they want to bring it to work?
I love you asked that, because this is exactly, one of the things that I focused on in my last book, which is called Campfire Lessons for Leaders, is this idea that, like, connecting with who you are is about really going into the past and saying, what makes me who I am? What is my narrative?
Mm-hmm.
And spending some time unlocking those moments. I call them flashpoints, these points in your journey that have ignited your gifts into the world, and spending some time not hiding from the past, but really understanding it. And so the more you understand yourself, you connect with yourself,
Yep.
then the more likely you can connect better with others. So unearthing the key stories that have made you who you are allows you to say, yeah, those aren't things that maybe, I might have seen as a challenging period in my life. It actually instead was a moment that maybe realized this is why I do what I do. I'll give you an example. I've interviewed quite a lot of people in my podcasts, the virtual campfire, and that's was a lot of the context of the book. But there's people who have come on who've said, hey, I was in the darkest moment of my life, or I was diagnosed with cancer, and I didn't know that if I would even live, for another year. And in that moment, I realized that, life is precious, and I wanted to make the most of every moment. Yeah.
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 And
Go ahead.
yeah, so I think when you were mentioning about that, I started thinking, actually, when I started my career in 2012, that was, I didn't know up until now. I mean, yeah, I know it was a turning point or a flash point, or I'm sure there's other words for it. But that was like one of the moments in my career where I was like applying for tons of jobs. I was on a student visa, so no biotech or pharma company wanted to sponsor my job employment visa, and it was a uphill battle. I think I applied to like 100 plus jobs. I even stopped counting after a certain point,
Yeah.
and nothing was working out. Like I hired resume writers, I hired like interview prep people, and I read all the books. Nothing was working for me at that time, and uh, that's when I talked to some other people in the industry through networking and whatever, and they said, "Hey, you can you can become a consultant and work as a consultant, and the agency will then help you with your student visa, and eventually you end up working for a pharma or biotech company." So you're still doing the same job, but you can at least start getting the experience. I moved from New York to Boston. I started working at Millennium Pharmaceuticals in Cambridge that ended up being acquired by Takeda, then worked at Biogen. And just those 4 years from 2012 to like 2016, it's like if I didn't take that leap and say, okay, you know what, this is not working, let me just go into consulting and see how it is, I would have not been here because my career would not have gone to where it has gone. So just that one decision to be like, okay, let me try this, went to 4 years. And then those 4 years brought like tons of other opportunities. And now it's 2024. So, yeah. So that's,
Yeah.
yeah.
I love that you share that because it's exactly the kind of thing that, like, it's that one decision that ignited your gifts into the world, or this idea of like being able to take that lesson of, there are options. There's, when you see a wall, you don't have to be stopped by that wall. Instead, look for opportunities to look around and say, how do I overcome this barrier? Well, the barrier might be overcome by looking at new options, and then you start to see as you move forward that I can do hard things. I can do things that are challenges at first, but ultimately they're surmountable. So
Yeah, yeah. And when you mention about flashpoints, a question I had for you is, uh, how can, so in terms of whether it's a person or a organization or a team, they all have different flashpoints, right? Like, so you
yeah,
mentioned about Genzyme, let's say, or Henry, right? So Genzyme as a company has a flashpoint. Henry has
yeah.
or had his flashpoints. The other people in the team had their own. So how can everyone identify their own flashpoint and sort of align to the company's flashpoint to where they want to go? I've seen this in sports where some teams have this identity about them that, they are gritty or they are underdogs
Mm,
or whatever you want to call it, and everyone embraces that and they're like, hey, this is who I am, nobody believes in me, but I'm going to win it all, right? So can you share
yeah.
an example of how can it be in an organization versus an employee or person can identify their flashpoints and connect it all together?
I love that you shared this because you just brought to light the thing that I've been exploring a lot since the book came out. When you write a book, sometimes it takes on a new life when it's published, and I thought about it as more a personal flashpoint as opposed to a company thing. But the more I've explored this conversation with other people, I'm like, yeah, this absolutely is something that a company can explore as their identity. What are the things that have made us who we are? What were the moments that challenged us, like that first clinical trial that failed and almost had us on the ropes of going out of business because we didn't know how to move forward, but then one glimmer of good clinical data that allowed us to see the light, right? And to be able to move forward and then change the dynamics of the business or whatever it may be. That those are the kind of things that can help a company to define what it is their narrative, their through line that allows them to share with others and to enroll others to want to come on the mission for the next chapter. As I said, the byline of the book is how uncovering your past can propel you forward, and that's a powerful image when you think about it. When you go back and look at the past by exploration, and it's not just one person working alone. If it's a company, it's really saying, well, what are the things, even the most challenging periods, that we learned a lot from that allowed us to really leapfrog forward
Mm-hmm.
and propel us to where we are today, and will propel us even further from where we are today. And I think that is a really good way to explore that, is to do it as a group, to have a
Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah, and also there are other examples that I was thinking as you're mentioning it. This, Airbnb, the founder Brian Chesky. There's been like a lot of screenshots and stuff on social media when he had emailed like some investors when he was in Y Combinator, and like some big investors told him, no, nobody's gonna rent out their home and turn it into a bed and breakfast, and he still pursued that idea. And Airbnb, I know there are some haters and lovers of Airbnb, but as a company it is it is, uh it was a minimal investment from two college kids, or whatever, when they were in Y Combinator, and it's a big company. Another one is Canva. So the CEO of Canva, also, she's a female CEO, and she faced a lot of, critics that didn't want to invest or didn't think that she could build that company. That's like $1 billion plus company, and it's a very unique product that tons of people in social media and all over are using that every day. So those are two examples that at least I've seen of how those two leaders knew their personal flashpoint, and literally it became their company's flashpoint, as they started leading. So
Yeah, and to challenge that to even further, to say, I mean, and those are great examples, by the way. I think there's also a sense of this, which is to say that life goes on, and they
mm,
continue to have moments that challenge them to say, well, maybe my image, the image of, let's look at Elon Musk for just a moment, not to
yep,
dwell on him because I know he is a very polarizing figure, but um,
sure,
maybe there's a moment now that he's, starts to think, what's my flashpoint moment in this moment where I need to think differently about how I'm leading, how my companies are developing. And, it gives him an opportunity to change the path he's on or change the way he shows up. And I have a strong belief that there's leaders and organizations that can change a trajectory by, if I can say the word, by simply taking that moment to reflect and say, where do we come from? Where are we now? Where do we want to go? And how do we use all of those points to really understand the things that we know about ourselves to do what's the right thing for the next chapter?
yeah, yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned Elon, because I did read his biography book, and it's intense. Like, there are some parts
Sure.
in there, texts, or not text, but like uh messages or opinions from employees who are still working there, or who worked at Tesla or SpaceX. And that it was his identity. Like, at one point, I think Tesla was going bankrupt, and he basically didn't want that to happen, so he ended up, putting 70, 80 hours, whatever. And there are messages in there from employees who are getting a phone call at 4 a.m. to say, hey, can you come and finish this part of this engineering run so that we can move on? And literally, they had to put on their PJs and go to work. And some people quit because they're like, I can't do this. But others were bought into the idea, and they knew that, Tesla was a unique company, and they wanted to be part of that journey. And he had told them this is not going to be easy, but they were all bought in, right? So it's a good example of, yeah, you can always agree or disagree to how a leader, in this case Elon, he has a lot of haters and lovers for multiple reasons, but yeah, it's buying into that idea, and then, knowing that that's what it's going to take.
Yeah. And he really did an amazing job of selling the idea to the
Mm,
people who were those people who did show up and want to do the work because they believed in what he was building. And I think that's a really great quality of a leader who can share a vision of a future that people
yep.
want to engage in. I guess the downside of that is making sure that you also keep people's well-being in mind. I think that
Right.
is so critical too, is that it's great to get people to do things that are well beyond, the standard, but just make sure that you have their interests in mind as well, and you want to
Yep.
care for their well-being, because you can't put people in burnout states
Mm.
um, for extended periods of time, period.
Yeah, yeah. And I had a friend in tech who made this quote, and he was telling me, because we were having a discussion about Tesla and electric cars and whatnot, and he's like, Tesla doesn't sell cars; it sells a commitment to climate change. And there are people who want a Tesla because they want to signal to the world that I am committed to the climate change and using electric vehicles or whatever. And I think
Mhm.
Elon really used that in his storytelling. If you watch some of the investor, like videos and stuff that he did, he was really honing in his story on that point. So it was never about, oh, look at this Tesla, look at the wheel, look at this. It was more about, hey, this is what we need for reducing, the carbon footprint and for the climate. This is what we need, and that's what he sold over and over again. And that's why a lot of people, now it looks great, it's a great looking car, but this is a quote that he said, Tesla doesn't sell cars, it sells commitment to climate change. So that was interesting take from him. I
It's
know
like the
another.
quote from the Little Prince. If you remember the book, The Little Prince,
No.
um, there's a it's written by a Frenchman. I can't remember his name exactly, but there's this quote about, instead of trying to motivate people to step up and do the work, instead have them long for the sea. Instead of motivating them to build a ship, have them long for the sea. And I'll have to get that quote all dialed in for you, but nonetheless, go look it up. You'll find it.
Yeah, there's another similar one. It's have you did you play Mario Brothers video game
Yeah,
as a kid? Yeah.
of
So do you
course.
know, like, yeah, do you know the part where, like, uh the the character, like, knocks, like, he bumps the bricks with his head, and then he, I think it's like a mushroom or something, and then he becomes really big and powerful. So I've seen this, like, image on social media where somebody said, okay, this is the character, this is the superpower that he needs, and then this is what the character becomes. And oftentimes people, when they sell a product or service, they're focusing on that middle piece of what this character will consume. But that's not what you should focus on. You should focus on the end result, what that character will become after taking your product or service. And it was a very nice visual of, like, hey, if you sell this, you will not have to worry about all the other parts because you're selling the outcome, not, you know the product or the service. Yeah, I'm sure if you look up Mario Brothers marketing or something on LinkedIn or Twitter, you'll find a lot of posts on that topic. At least I've seen many. So uh, I want to jump into another topic that I have here, which is, you also talked about this a lot in your content. It's about divergent minds and convergent hearts, and why is it important, first of all, to embrace different point of views in workplace, and then how can we bring these two together?
Yeah. I mean, it's so important, first of all, because if we're hiring the same people over and over again and, bringing the people to the table and saying, okay, let's do some innovation. Let's build a strategy. Problem is that we're constantly going to be, hearing an echo chamber of people who agree with
Hmm.
us, of people who, bring the same ideas. But we need some healthy friction. We need people to bring new ideas, and the best way to do that is to have, divergent thinking, and that means bringing a diverse group of people from different industries, even, who are willing to speak up and say, hey, I don't get that, or, here's what I'm thinking about that, or here's my understanding of that situation. And all those things are welcomed, never, diminished by the people in the room, but instead say, yeah, you may think that's crazy, or you may think that's a stupid question, but that's not stupid. In fact, we should explore that. That's worth looking into, and those things help us to really, create something different in the world, which oftentimes is what's required. We're constantly getting new ideas by having different thinking in the world. And I would even argue to say we need neurodivergent thinking. Oftentimes, people are afraid to hire people with like neurodiverse backgrounds or
Hmm.
neurodiverse ways of thinking. The reality is there's some brilliance that we're leaving off the table if we don't bring them in the room. It requires some adjustment. It requires some grace and some ability for other people to slow down the way that they approach their way of running business. But ultimately, the benefits are huge.
Yeah.
And the reason why I talk about this idea of convergent hearts is that by opening the aperture a little bit and allowing other people in the room and listening to them, we may have a better understanding of them too. And that allows us to connect and maybe build relationships that long term helps us to feel seen and heard.
Hmm.
It's important.
Yeah, and the question I was thinking as you're mentioning about the divergent minds or bringing different perspectives, you mentioned that if a company or organization keeps hiring the same type of people or with the same experience, everybody starts sounding the same or has the same input, and you're missing out on that different perspective in a meeting or in a room. But as an individual, if you let's say if I want to be intentionally uh, divergent in my thinking, what can I do, right? Like if I'm let's say in quality, if I'm in a technology or a software developer, or I'm a project manager and I just keep getting project manager roles one after another because it's a better pay, a higher promotion, I'm always going to be in the same type of room with the same type of people. So, what are some of the tips that you give people to become more divergent thinkers? Should they be like reading books? Should they be taking a completely different job and putting themselves in an uncomfortable environment that forces them to think different? What are some of the tips?
Well, I love that you bring this up because
Yeah.
it's all of those things and much more. It's really about thinking about your consumption. What are you consuming?
Mm,
What is there's your steady diet of consumption of information, and where is it coming from? So it might require, reading different books. You know, pull at the threads of the things that on the left field or in the right field of how you're currently thinking. If you're deep in the quality space, maybe it's time for you to think like, hey, I wonder like wonder if I could find out a little bit more information about what it's like to be to understand what the finance perspective is, or to
mm,
understand what does marketing do and how do they do it. This can be done through what I call curiosity conversations,
yep.
conversations that are just geared to getting to know people and getting to know how do they think, what do they do, what are some of the hot topics that are on their minds, with no other agenda than to just expand your own understanding and hopefully also give them some perspective of
Yep.
yourself. So yes, conversations, books for sure. Pick up that book that you potentially be like, I don't know, that's not typically me, but I think I'd be curious as to see, what does the art world have to say about innovation? Um, what is the maybe there's something I can learn about brain science. I don't know, but those things that are just on the to the left of what you normally would look at, try it. Um, Podcasts and what have you. So I think whatever you can do, try new things, do new things. It doesn't mean you have to stick with them. It just means that you have to be willing to experiment in different arenas. And that alone allows you to start to be more neuroplastic and just allow yourself to expand your ability to think like, wow, interesting. Just even spending a little time with those people got me thinking differently. Make
Yeah, and
sense?
oftentimes, I think this is the challenge I had is when I was never a good reader in my teenage years or even up until when I was like in my 20s. And then once I started, working in corporate and I wanted to read more about business or finance or entrepreneurship or
Yeah.
whatever, uh, I was always reading for an answer, right? And sometimes that's good, but other times you also just want to read just for the sake of reading, because
Yeah.
I could read 20 pages and leave with just one tip that could potentially be life changing, or I could listen to a 30-minute podcast and just find one quote and just think about that quote, right? So it's not
Yeah.
always, we always feel like, oh, every single minute of this podcast has to be helpful, and it's never that. It's always that one idea that you never heard of. Like you told me about the book today, No Rules Rules. I'd never heard of it, but now I know. I will remember that you gave me that recommendation, and when I read that book, that will be on the top of the mind. So I think it's curiosity is definitely great, but also just being open to not seeing it as a transaction. Like, oh, if I put 30 minutes in, I should be getting 30 minutes worth of value from this, because
No.
that's easily, you can disappoint yourself.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you take away what you can take away, and it's not like you're being tested. It's instead, it's about like this is for my own enjoyment slash expansion of my mind, and therefore I can take out of it whatever I like. But ultimately, the key thing is to reflect on it and say, yeah, I just took in that information. Well, what do I want to integrate? What do I want to keep? And what I want to say, like, yeah, some of that's just not really relevant to me, and that's okay.
Yeah, there's always this debate of being a specialist versus a generalist. Should you just like go deep into one topic for 20 years and become the best person in the world in that topic, or should you chase five or six different things, like be the data scientist who's also a stellar violin player? That's those are
Mm.
two completely different domains. Data science and music, they have no relation. uh and I've had that discussion with many people, and they have a very strong opinion that no, you should just be one thing. And I feel like you should try to do as many things as possible. And I made a post on LinkedIn, and I got a lot of good feedback and a lot of criticism. I said something like, if you're starting your career in pharma, uh you should learn bits and pieces of everything. So you should, if you're in QA, try to learn about clinical trials, try to learn about manufacturing, try to learn about technology. And many people agreed with that. And I said, if you learn all of these things for 3 or 4 months, within 2 years you will be dangerous. Like, people will not be able to compete with your knowledge, because you'll suddenly be able to connect all the dots. And some people like, no, your resume is going to look all whack. You need to just stick to one thing and do that, because in early on in your career you want to show, going back to our discussion, that you have done the same thing in the past, year after year after year. And that was their argument. But I personally feel like you should try to dabble in different things. I don't know, what's your take? Are you on one side, or do you feel they both have a space in the room?
Well, I 100% agree with what you're saying, and I'm more on your side of the perspective. But I think the key thing is to, even though you're dipping your toe in other areas, doesn't mean you have to go in and deeply swim in
Mm,
them.
yeah.
What it means is having conversations doesn't mean that you're committing to throw out the baby with the bathwater, if you know what I
Mm,
mean.
mm,
Um, you can be in playing in the quality space, but really having conversations and maybe getting on projects involving other areas is going to make you a better quality person.
yeah.
And eventually, at some point, you decide, hey, if I really want to expand my capacity to be a well-rounded biotech leader, then ultimately, maybe it's time for me to look at like another aspect of the business. Maybe it's about expanding into regulatory, or it's about getting into project management, program management, or there could
Mm,
be many aspects of how you pivot and create different parts of it. And by having that exposure that you've gotten, you start to see pathways and ways that people would say, like, yeah, I've always had good conversations with Harsh. He's someone I'd like to, and I would definitely invest in him because he's someone who's curious, interested, and he's got a well-rounded sense of how things work.
mm,
Whereas if someone who just says, I'll put my head down, go deep in one area, and that's it, that's not going to serve them, because they're ultimately going to be pigeonholed as they only know quality. And I'm not saying this to be a jerk to anyone in quality. If you love what you do what you do. But I'm just saying that having the ability to play in other fields is not about like do quality one month, the next month you leave your job and go to another job. You know, it's about having well-rounded understanding, not necessarily jumping from job to job.
Yeah, that's a very important takeaway. What we've had so much amazing conversation and topics today. What's one thing you want the listeners to take away from this discussion?
Yeah, well, I would say the first thing you can do, that I'd like to leave people with is, if you're feeling stuck or if you're feeling like you need a new perspective, I like to share that expand your vision and narrow your focus. Expanding your
Hmm.
vision is really about what else is possible, what else is available to me, where can I get curious and dig deeper? And then once you've identified something you want to explore, then you can narrow down and say, hey, this is an area I'd like to spend more time, go deeper. Yeah.
Love that
And that
quote.
way
Yeah.
you can get into action.
Expand your vision and narrow your focus. Yeah,
Yes.
that's lovely. Uh, Listen, it's been amazing having you on. Thank you so much. I know you're busy. You're doing bunch of stuff, and I follow your content on LinkedIn. So, uh, thank you for everything you're posting and all the books and shows that you're doing. For the listeners who want to connect with you or who want to have you, in their company or for a talking event or just reach out to you, what's the best way to connect with you?
Well, the best place to find me is at my website, which is ipurposepartners.com.
Yep.
And so you can go there and you can find a bunch of stuff there. And then also LinkedIn, as you know, I'm pretty active there. You can find me at my name, Tony Martignetti, with a one at the end as opposed to an I.
Okay, great. And I will also put some of the books or anything, the TED talk that we mentioned in the show notes. So for the
Fantastic.
listeners, you'll be able to find those links in the show notes once the episode is live, and you'll be able to check them out too.
Wonderful.
Thanks, Tony. Appreciate your time and wish you all the best. And keep doing what you're doing and keep inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you.